All right. Welcome back to Man and Golf Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doc Russ, and we are here for episode number 2 of this brand new season here as we are getting a little bit cooler here in the upstate New York area. Again, we're based out of Rochester, New York, and right now the current temperature is balmy 49 degrees, but we want to be able to kind of continue to answer your questions that you continue to kind of graciously ask us. So we've got 2 more questions that we want to address today, and we're going to kind of lay it out for you guys to give us an idea to give you guys an idea as to what we want to kind of look at and how we want to address some of the questions that we're kind of getting. So let's get right into it. If you are not familiar with our podcast, we used to do kind of a guest format where we would have a guest on. We would ask them about a bunch of different questions with regards to golf performance and things like that. But there was, again, questions that very, very, very specific to individual golfers that they wanted to have answered. And so that's why we're using this platform to be able to do so. So the first question I will read to you for this week's episode is, what is one thing I should focus on as I start my off-season golf plans? And again, much like last week, this is a pretty loaded question. I think the number one question I would ask you is, what's the priority? What's the goal? Why are we improving X, Y, or Z, right? And again, and what's your goal? Is it more distance? Is it more accuracy? Is it better ball striking? Are you trying to change your swing to have a different ball flight? So if you were, let's say, more of a fade person, do you want to draw the ball more? I think a lot of it comes down to what your goal is. If your goal is to improve some of these qualities that you're looking for to ultimately make you more consistent golfer so you can shoot lower scores, I think that's where you need to kind of figure it out. Number 2, I would ask is, do you have a coach that you work with? Not only a physical coach, so like a trainer or let's say a performance coach who can help you with some of the physical qualities of that, but also a skill coach. Do you have a swing instructor or a swing coach that is able to kind of guide you some of the things that you want to kind of work on, right? If you want to use the off season to make some tinkers to your swing, then are you doing it based off of just videos that you're finding on Instagram and YouTube, or are you doing it based off of objective feedback or feedback that you're getting directly from a coach who is well versed in the golf swing, knows the positions that you need to kind of be in, and being able to then come up with a plan and a practice plan to be able to implement throughout the off season. So the first question is, what's your goal? Second question is, are you working with someone? And then I would ultimately say that now more than ever, there are so many opportunities to work with golf coaches. Again, there's a lot of times now with virtual and things like YouTube and things like Zoom and the Skillest app and things like that. There's so many opportunities to work with golf coaches from across the world, and I think a lot of it comes down to, are you comfortable getting lessons from someone who is not physically in the room with you? And again, how do you learn? Right? Are you good with just seeing something and then being able to implement it on your own and having someone look at you through a camera or through a phone? Or do you need someone physically to put you in positions to be able to understand where those positions are, own those positions, and then figure out how you can kind of use your practice plan moving forward to be able to help you kind of get to where you need to be? So I think working with a swing coach is really, really important if you want to make some of the changes that you want to make to be able to shoot lower scores. And I always kind of say, like, on the flip side of that, while working with a swing coach is great, working with a performance coach or someone who understands the physical aspects of golf becomes that much more important, so that the skill work that you're going to do is going to be really, really fruitful, and it's going to be beneficial, but also too, hopefully it sticks a lot faster and you can kind of make those gains a lot quicker as well. We always kind of tell people, like, if you're planning on working with a swing coach, then you need to get your body assessed first. If you know what your physical limitations are or physical characteristics are, but if there's certain physical limitations that you have that you cannot literally try and work through, then you need to make modifications to how you set up or the positions of your body, so that when you do the skill work that you're going to do with your coach, it's going to be a lot more advantageous. It's going to be a lot more beneficial for you in the long run. And you won't be overly frustrated, because if your swing coach wants you to get into X, Y, or Z position, but your body physically can't do that, then that becomes a little bit more of a challenge when it comes to trying to kind of make the gains that you want to make. So again, your physical performance coach should work hand in hand with your swing coach to figure out how you can integrate a plan or modify a plan based on what works best for you. So I think that becomes really, really important when it comes to your off-season plans. And then ultimately, too, you need to find, how are you measuring your progress, right? Are you getting baseline data to be able to then figure out as you go through this off season, again, whether that's 12 weeks, 24 weeks, whatever, how long your off season is, are you looking to see if you're making progress, right? What does that look like? So from a physical standpoint, are you looking at, let's say, body composition, body fat percentage, to be able to get your body healthier for golf, to be able to walk longer or play more rounds on consecutive days? Are you looking at body fat percentage? Are you looking at, let's say, a 3 rep or a 5 rep, or let's say a 10 rep max test to determine what your strength is? Or are you doing endurance tests? Are you doing power tests to determine where your power is coming from? Is it coming from your upper body, your core, or your lower body? Those are all the physical things that we would kind of look at too, to make sure that we understand what our goals are, and are we making progress with the program that we're doing to make sure we're getting to where we need to be. And then also from a skill standpoint, again, we're not swing coaches. We won't pretend that we're swing coaches, but at the same point in time, we always like to kind of measure progress, right? Is that club head speed? Is that ball speed? Is that distance? Or are we measuring it just for certain clubs? Or are we measuring it throughout the bag, right? What are we looking at to make sure that we can understand, at the beginning of the offseason, this is what my distance was, my ball speed, my club head speed for these clubs. And now 3 months later, I retest it. Do those numbers get better, right? Because ultimately, if you're finding the center of the face better, if you're striking the ball better with more consistency, and ultimately your body's moving more efficiently and sequencing better when it comes to the downswing and through follow through, then that's going to go a long way in changing those distances. And you want to make sure that you understand and at least track those distances or track those numbers, so that as you go throughout the offseason, again, you're making progress. And that progress is what you want to see when you're trying to make these changes in the offseason. So I think, again, while people always focus on one thing they should, when it comes to the offseason, whether that's getting stronger, improving club head speed, reducing injuries, whatever that looks like, that's a loaded gamut that you can kind of go through, right? Ultimately, you want a well-rounded approach of physical characteristics, swing characteristics, skill work, practice work, and all that stuff integrated into a practice plan that is based around your schedule, to make sure that you can, one, get it done, because consistency becomes so important in the gym, but also when it comes to skill work. And then number two, making sure that the progress that the things that you're trying to implement, you're actually seeing the gains that you want. So that becomes really, really important, right? And I think that's why, when it comes to prioritizing the offseason, working with a coach or finding a plan that makes the most sense for you becomes really, really important. Okay, let's go on to the second question. So the second question here is from someone from our audience. So it says, I've been dealing with wrist pain that I experience when I make impact with the golf ball. Do you have any exercises that can help alleviate this discomfort? Now, I will say this, while I think everyone is looking for the magic bullet, the magic, the secret sauce to improving X, Y, or Z pain, and while exercise is definitely the way to kind of go, I think we need to kind of look a little bit deeper to kind of figure out like what's happening here, right? So it sounds like when you make impact with the golf ball, your wrist is bothering you. Now, the question I always ask is like, is it lead wrist versus trail wrist? Again, there's a lot of context that we need further to determine how best to kind of help you. But I think when it comes to figuring out the source of the issue or the why of what's happening, we need to, one, understand where is it coming from. Is it truly coming from the wrist? Is it coming from the elbow? Or is it coming from the neck? Right? Because there's a lot of things that can refer into the wrist and hand from the neck if we're having some radicular or referred pain coming from somewhere else, right? Same thing from the elbow, right? There's a lot of things in the elbow that can refer pain into the wrist as well. So I think the important part is, number one, is where is that actually coming from? Is it truly coming from the wrist? And if it is, that's totally fine. We can address that. But we always want to make sure we can rule out other areas first to make sure that we can then focus in on the wrist. Okay, that's step one. Okay. Number two is, if you are having discomfort with impact, the questions I have is it worse when you make impact when you're swinging, when the ball is like elevated off on a tee, or does it not matter, right? Again, if you hit a thin shot or if you hit a heavy shot, does that matter when it comes to the discomfort that you're experiencing? Does it intensify based on those environments and based on those scenarios? And again, normally with wrist type discomfort, it will feel more uncomfortable with heavier hits because you're making more contact with the ground. But also too, even with thinner hits, if you catch the ball thin, it can sometimes, that vibration can definitely kind of impact the wrist there as well. So I think the important part is you got to understand while these questions that we're going to answer are going to be really important to help give you a little bit of context as to what we're thinking about in our brain, there's also a lot of things that go into these questions that we can only answer based off of the feedback and the context around the conversation. So I think when it comes to if we're dealing solely with just wrist pain, there's a couple of things you want to kind of look at. Number one is this TFCC. It's called a triangular fibrocartilage complex, right? And basically what that is just this cartilage that's on the palm aspect of the wrist. And it's very, very heavily involved when it comes to, one, making impact with the golf ball, but also, two, then turning the club over as you go through transition into your follow through. And what we do see is with that TFCC, there's a small little bone in there called the hook of your hamate, where sometimes if you do heavy hits frequently and you make heavy contact with the ground, sometimes that can cause that bone to what we call an avulsion fracture, where now that hook of the hamate kind of dislodges from where it's attached to the hand or the bone of the hand, and that can definitely kind of play a factor in terms of where you're having some of that wrist discomfort. Number two, the things you want to kind of worry about are the joint itself. Right, the wrist joint is where the bones of the carpal bones of your hand meet these two bones, your radius and ulna of your forearm. Okay, and so sometimes if there is some joint irritation, or if there's something kind of going on, or an inflammatory condition going on in the wrist joint, that's what's going to cause some discomfort with impact as well, right? So while we look at some of the cartilage and ligaments around the wrist, we also want to look at what are we dealing with regards to the wrist joint itself that could be contributing to the discomfort that people are experiencing. And lastly, what we look at too is we get a lot of discomfort, especially too if people have a tendency to kind of make sure we're either bowing the wrist or kind of changing the wrist angle, or hinging more when it comes to the wrist. Those ligaments and areas, structure on the outside of the wrist here, but also on the inside part of the wrist here, those areas become really, really affected when it comes to someone who's hinging very, very hard at the top of your backswing. And then either, let's say, like we talked about last week, if they're casting or scooping, that can sometimes create some irritation on the outside parts of the wrist or inside parts of the wrist. And those are the areas that we want to kind of take a look at. Now, again, the problem is right in the wrist, there's not a ton of muscle there. There's a lot of tendons that kind of run across the wrist. There's a lot of ligaments on the inside and outside part of the wrist. And again, the problem with ligamentous stuff or tendinous type things are tendons and ligaments in general, generally speaking, don't get a lot of blood supply. Right, so if you're not getting a lot of blood supply to that tissue, then sometimes if it is irritated, sometimes it can take longer for that tissue to heal, especially if we're constantly using that area. Now, again, the problem with the wrist and the hand is whether we're gripping, doing day-to-day stuff, you're using that in addition to them using the golf swing, that can definitely create more irritation, especially if it's already painful to begin with. So the three areas we would kind of take a look at is, one, that TFCC area, that cartilage that we kind of see has a tendency to be irritated with impact, but also too with a lot of heavy hits from the downswing. Number two is the wrist joint itself. Right? Are we having some discomfort when we get into these end ranges of motion or extreme ranges of motion, either with rotation or with flexion and extension? Okay, so the wrist joint becomes an issue, especially if there's some inflammation kind of happening in the wrist joint. We need to kind of get that to settle down. And then lastly is the ligaments on the inside and outside of the wrist joint itself, right? So again, if we're a heavy hinger, right, or if we have a tendency to cast and scoop, sometimes that constant motion, or as we turn over the club to be able to kind of follow through, sometimes those motions can definitely give you some issues and potentially cause the source of the discomfort you're experiencing in your wrist. And so I guess that was a very long-winded answer for like what exercises can you do to help alleviate that discomfort. I would say is, I always kind of talk about the wrist is you want to be able to strengthen the wrist as much as you can through those full ranges of motion, right? So whether that's taking a dumbbell or even just taking your golf club and then kind of working through that deviation through your hinge back and forth, or working on using dumbbells that work on wrist curls back and forth into extension and flexion, and then ultimately to bicep curls, things like that, where you're working on rotational movements, that become really, really important when it comes to overall wrist and wrist health in general. I will say too, carrying things, heavy loaded carries where you're working on forearm strength here, because again, all these muscles that cross over the wrist joint come from the forearm. So the more you can kind of work on grip work, whether that's compound lifts like trap bar deadlifts, or if we're working on just loaded carries where we're taking weights and just carrying them or just holding them in place for time, your grip strength becomes really, really important to help protect the wrist joint from further irritation and further accumulation of stress. So I would say anything where you can work through a full range of motion with some resistance, loaded carries, right, where you're using those weights and just holding on there to kind of work on grip strength, but also grip endurance. And then lastly, compound lifts, trap bar deadlifts, things like bicep curls, rowing, things like that, where anytime you're involving the grip, that's going to go a long way in helping kind of hopefully protect the wrist joint when it comes to that stuff. Remember, golf involves speed and power with rotation, right? And the wrist is no different, right? You get a lot of hinge, and at the top, as you come down, you make impact, and then from there, you turn that wrist over, and that sometimes can create a lot of stress if we're not ready to handle it. So that's why, again, that baseline level of foundational strength and endurance goes a long way in protecting a lot of these joints that are getting stressed often when it comes to the golf swing. So those are the two questions that I think we want to kind of cover today. I think the important part is when it comes to off-season planning, right? Having a plan is important, right? But also, too, understanding what are you truly trying to prioritize. Is it skill work? Is it body work? Is it a combination of both? And usually it is a combination of both. If it's just skill work and you're not doing anything physically, I strongly suggest that you change that. Because that's going to go a long way. The physical aspects are going to go a long way in helping you be able to practice a lot of the skill stuff that you're going to do in the off season, especially if you're coming off of an injury. If you're coming off of an injury from the golf season, and then you're trying to work on all these different swing changes, if your body's already hurt to begin with, you need to try and get that stuff under control. Then from there start on working on a plan to be able to kind of change some of those things there. So I think the important part is, again, if you are working on an off-season plan and you don't really have a coach that's either a skill coach, a swing coach, swing instructor, or someone that's working with you physical, then I think those are the two places I will work on to try and invest in. Those, and again, that can be remotely, that can be in person. It really kind of depends on what you feel is the most bang for your buck. So, the off-season plans become really important. And again, here in upstate New York, our off-season is very, very long. We always kind of have a tendency to start our off-season programming with a lot of our golfers kind of towards the mid to end of November, because again, we don't start playing golf outside till around April at the earliest. And so again, that's a solid 4 or 5 months of an off season where we want to make sure we lay the foundation. And then from there, as we get closer to those preseason months, that's when we start to kind of ramp up some of the more golf specific things. But again, skill work takes a little bit longer because you've got to get the reps in. You got to make sure that you can get the body in the positions you want to get it in, right? And then from there, do the reps, whether that's, again, pauses in the positions to be able to own those positions, working on slow tempo throughout those positions, and a number of different ways to kind of lock those in. And then lastly, when it comes to the wrist pain, again, wrist pain is something that I think is really, really overlooked when it comes to the golf swing. People just expect, to have some wrist soreness here and there. But again, if you can identify where the pain is coming from, if you can then address some of the specific tissues or the local tissues that you're dealing with, that becomes really important. And then from there, again, like we talked about, I'll talk about it till I'm blue in the face. Like strength training goes a long way in, mitigating a lot of this stuff from happening. So, thank you all for your questions. We have a lot of questions we have to kind of run through here, but I wanted to kind of highlight those two for this second episode of our Man of Golf Performance podcast, or our relaunch here. So again, if you guys have any further questions, please make sure you kind of leave it on the comments or send us a message. Send us an email. My email is russ@manaperformancetherapy.com. Send us an email with some of your questions with regards to golf performance and how we can help you play your best golf yet. If you aren't already subscribed to our page, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell so you know when these podcasts are launching. And again, we'll also make sure that we upload the audio to all the other podcast platforms. So if you're not here on YouTube, you can check them out somewhere else. All right. We'll check in next week, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks.